Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're taking on something pretty ambitious. We are going to try and crack open some of the oldest historical narratives we have. Specifically the books of Joshua, Judges, and Samuel. And our goal here isn't just to read them as, a simple record of events or as fables with a moral.
No, not at all.
We're trying to uncover their original, I'd even say revolutionary intent. We want to understand how these texts, which were written during a time of complete national collapse, actually provided a blueprint for recovery. And more than that, how they defined what true leadership really looks like.
That shift in perspective is, I think, the most important thing to get your head around right at the start. It's really the cornerstone of this entire deep dive.
Right.
Because if you approach these books in the traditional way, as a simple chronicle, a historical report of what happened, the narrative can feel, well, frankly, it can feel disjointed.
And morally ambiguous, for sure.
Very. And the conclusions often feel contradictory. But our sources today, they really insist that we have to move beyond that historical chronicle mindset.
Exactly. The source material we're working with, it really forces you to view these texts not as ancient news reports, but as incredibly sophisticated, intentional literature.
Forged in fire, really.
Absolutely. Forged in the crucible of disaster. We're talking about the Babylonian captivity, the period of exile, or what our source calls the pierogi.
And when you understand that the authors were the exiles, the porodu, people who had literally lost everything, their land, their temple, their whole political identity, suddenly the question driving their writing becomes singular.
And desperate.
Profoundly desperate. It's how do we recover? How do we live again? And these books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, they are their theological answer. They're a meticulously crafted plan for restoration.
So it's not just history, it's a theological argument for survival.
It is. It represents the exiles' attempt to understand why they failed and, maybe more importantly, who they needed to become to succeed in the future.
And that framework, reading these texts as restoration literature, it gives us a really clear, logical structure for our conversation today. We're going to trace the argument these exilic authors are making right across these three texts. We'll start with Joshua, which defines that initial necessary mission, get the land back. Then we move into Judges, which is like a catastrophic failure analysis. Why did they fail to hold on to the land?
The postmortem.
The postmortem, exactly. And then finally, we arrive at the book of Samuel, which identifies the specific, essential type of leader needed to prevent that kind of collapse from ever happening again. Our mission here is to uncover that profound theological intent that's hidden just beneath the surface under the structure and the titles, and then connect these ancient anxieties directly to our most pressing contemporary challenges.
So it's a journey from mission to failure to the ideal leader.
That's it. Let's dive in.
Okay.
So let's start with that narrative flow, the one established by the author's writing during this exilic period. It seems they organize this whole history around three really critical pillars. It moves the reader logically from the goal to the method and then finally to the necessary guide.
That's right. The first pillar defines the what, and that is the book of Joshua. If you are in exile, you're sitting in Babylon, humiliated, stateless, your number one political and spiritual necessity is the recovery of the land.
It's everything. It's your identity.
It's your entire identity. So the book of Joshua, for them, it provides the blueprint. It's the historical precedent. And crucially, it's the legal justification for getting back their territory. It's the foundation of their entire national identity moving forward.
And looking at Joshua through that lens, through the eyes of those exiles, it suddenly gives us a context for some of the most, let's say, difficult passages in the text. I'm talking about the commands to dispossess or even kill the inhabitants of the land.
Precisely. The source material argues that if we read those commands as universal moral directives, as a simple chronicle of what happened, they present an almost insurmountable moral problem for every generation that reads them.
Right. It's horrifying if you read it that way.
It is, but when you understand it as restoration literature written during the exilic period, you see the authors were embedding an idea. The idea that these actions were viewed as a historical national security necessity for recovery at that specific time.
Okay, so let me see if I get this. The exilic authors included these sections not as some kind of celebration of violence.
Absolutely not.
But as a form of documentation. They're saying that the reclamation of the territory, which was the foundation of their future covenant identity, required dealing with the previous occupants. It was framed as a tragic imperative for national survival.
Yes. A tragic imperative. It was a way of justifying their hope to return and reconstitute their nation. It really changes everything about how you interpret it. If the land is the absolute foundation, and that foundation has been utterly lost, then the previous occupation has to be read as a failure to execute that initial command.
The authors needed to show their audience, the other exiles, that recovery was possible, but it required, what, total dedication?
Total uncompromising dedication. But as history shows, and as the exiles knew all too well, the recovery effort fails repeatedly. And that leads us directly into the second pillar, the Book of Judges.
Okay.
And here, the central theme shifts. It moves from the initial what getting the land to the how do we maintain the land, and more importantly, how do we avoid future collapse?
So Judges is basically a massive failure analysis.
It is structurally designed as exactly that. And the answer that the exilic writers give for how do we avoid this disaster again is really twofold. First, they say it's through sincere repentance. And second, it's through the intervention of a deliverer or a savior. The book just details this agonizing cycle that people fell into over and over again.
It's apostasy, then divine oppression.
Then they cry out for deliverance.
And a judge, a temporary savior, arrives.
Right. And you get temporary salvation. But it's immediately followed by a return to apostasy. The cycle just gets faster and worse.
It's the ultimate frustrating loop to read, and the historical perspective here for the exiles must have been just critical. The lesson is that, true, lasting recovery doesn't depend on political stability or military strength.
No.
It depends entirely on the moral and spiritual status of the people themselves, their willingness to repent and stay faithful.
And this cycle just accelerates and spirals downwards until the book reaches its horrific, chaotic conclusion. And that conclusion sets up the entire transition to Samuel. We hear that damning lament, which acts as the epitaph for the entire era.
In those days, there was no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes.
That's the line. And that phrase, there was no king, it's so often misunderstood by modern readers. We hear it as a simple political statement. Oh, they just needed a monarchy.
Right, they needed a government.
But the source really emphasizes a critical nuance here. The exiles were using the word king or wang to reference something much, much bigger than a political figurehead.
So what did they mean by it?
They meant a true, moral, authoritative anchor. A person sent by God, what they would call Oga's God's person. The lack of this spiritual and moral authority, this true guide, is what allowed their society to completely implode.
So it wasn't a lack of a political system. It was a lack of internal shared moral guidance.
That's it. And that resulted in the external chaos. The people were just left adrift, do whatever they thought was best in their own eyes, which led directly to the civil wars and the moral degradation we see in the final horrible chapters of Judges.
So the structure is just perfectly logical, and for that exilic audience, it must have been devastatingly effective. Joshua sets the necessary goal, the land. Judges demonstrates the catastrophic failure of the people and their temporary leaders to maintain that foundation. And this failure creates an urgent existential demand. Who is this truly necessary leader? The one who can finally provide that moral and spiritual anchor, the true Wang.
Exactly. The conclusion of Judges is not just an ending. It is a desperate, open question mark. It demands the introduction of the one figure who can embody the answer to their systemic failure. And that takes us directly into the book named after him.
And this is where we really hit that revolutionary insight, the one that challenges, decades of conventional interpretation. The next book in the historical sequence is called Samuel. But when you actually read the content, the narrative is overwhelmingly dominated by other people. It's about the transition to the monarchy, the tragic story of King Saul, and then the ascent and reign of King David, who, he effectively monopolizes all of 2 Samuel.
It's the title mismatch.
Yeah.
And it's something that is impossible to ignore if you assume the authors were just trying to create a straightforward chronicle of events.
Right. If titles were meant to follow content, this book should be called David, or maybe The Rise and Fall of King Saul and David, something like that.
Logically, yes. But the author, writing during the exilic period, consciously and deliberately chose the title Samuel.
So why? Why would a meticulous author who is crafting this deep theological argument for national survival name their most important work after a character who is, for large parts of it, a secondary character? It seems to minimize the impact of the supposed hero, David.
To understand why, we have to analyze the author's process, which is what the source material suggests. The creative process for high literature isn't simply content dictates the title. It's far more sophisticated than that.
Okay.
The author first determines the core theme. The source uses the word ru, or Jew, as the big idea. Then they select the necessary historical or even fictional material, deist or sojay, that is required to illustrate that theme.
So the stories of Saul and David are the material.
They are the material. And only then, at the very end, is the title affixed. And the title serves as the ultimate summary of the author's intent of their theme.
Wow, okay, so that makes the title Samuel a declaration, not just a summary. The author is telling the reader right from the start what this entire ensuing drama, the rise of Saul, the glorious success of David, and their eventual failures, what it's really about.
Precisely. The primary thesis of this whole work of restoration literature is to declare that the true essential leader, the spiritual Wang they've been waiting for since the chaos of Judges, was Samuel. He was the consecrated leader, not the political figures, Saul or David.
So Saul and David's stories are just the material being used.
They are merely the material used to show what happens when the nation chooses political convenience over the true spiritual anchor that Samuel represents.
I have to push back a little here just because this is so contrary to how we're taught to think. We are conditioned to see David as the paradigm, the great king, the ancestor of the Messiah, the, quote, man after God's own heart. What specific textual support does the source offer to elevate Samuel so dramatically above David?
It's a deep reading of the narrative structure itself. Just consider the actions of the political kings. Saul's rejected for disobedience. He sacrifices when only Samuel, the religious authority, should have done so. He blurs the lines. And David, despite all his successes, his story is continually marred by profound moral failures. Adultery, murder, constant internal political maneuvering, dynastic ambition, all of which lead to severe consequences for the nation. It ultimately fractures his own house and ensures instability for generations.
So the material, the stories of Saul and David, is actually there to show the failure of political and dynastic leadership. The very failure the exiles had just witnessed, culminating in the destruction of their own kingdom.
Yes. But Samuel, the namesake, he's introduced as the solution. He's the solution to the systemic corruption of the existing priesthood Eli's sons and the moral vacuum of the judges' period. Samuel embodies the purity, the devotion, and the spiritual authority that the true Wang required.
His whole life is different.
His very life is a Nazarite commitment, a level of dedication the nation desperately needed. The authors are basically screaming at their audience, "You fixated on David's political success, but you should have been modeling Samuel's consecrated character."
And the source notes that this isn't just a creative interpretation. This high status for Samuel is supported by other ancient Israelite texts. It specifically mentions the Psalms, where Samuel is evaluated in parallel with Moses.
This parallel is absolutely key. Think about it. Moses led them out of slavery and gave them the foundational law. Samuel guided them through their most profound existential transition, from the anarchy of judges to the establishment of the covenant structure under a monarchy.
They are the two bookends of their early national identity.
They are the two pillars of national guidance. To place Samuel on the same historical plane as Moses is to declare him one of the two most important figures in their entire national history. That puts him far, far above any political king.
So the message to the exiles who needed this radical change was unambiguous. It was, stop seeking a successful political king like David, whose political maneuvers and moral compromises ultimately failed your people.
Right.
Instead, seek a leader who embodies the uncompromising spiritual devotion of Samuel. The title itself is the author's critique of the entire era that the book covers.
It forces the reader to completely rethink the meaning of the book. It's not a celebration of the monarchy at all. It's an indictment of the nation for failing to recognize the true character of the leader they needed, even when he was right there in front of them.
The structural brilliance of this restoration literature, it just keeps going. It continues right into the opening scene. If the book's theme is defining this high standard of leadership embodied by Samuel, why on earth does the narrative begin with the personal, almost domestic story of Elkanah and his wife Hannah?
She's barren. She's suffering immense sorrow. She's dealing with her rival, Peninnah, and she's just consumed by humiliation. Why not start with the corrupt priests at the temple or the pressing political failures that required Samuel's intervention in the first place?
Because the opening material, the sojay they chose, is perfectly strategic. The authors, who are writing to this demoralized, exiled people, they understood that theology has to start in a place of empathy.
Okay.
Hannah's personal sorrow, her childlessness and shame, what the source calls ajay, it's not just a plot device to get the story started. It is a direct, visceral metaphor for the national sorrow of the exiles.
So the exiles, they too were humiliated. They were barren of a future. They were suffering that deep shame of being a nation without a land.
Exactly. This connection, it grounds the abstract theological crisis in tangible human experience. The source reminds us of the laments of the exiles by the rivers of Babylon, the context of Psalm 137. Their grief was so profound they couldn't even sing the songs of their homeland.
Hannah's inability to conceive, her bitterness, it perfectly mirrors Israel's perceived inability to bear a political or a spiritual future. The authors start the story in the deepest place of the reader's own pain.
That completely transforms Hannah's journey. It's no longer a personal anecdote, it becomes a national parable. So when Hannah finally goes up to Shiloh and prays, her personal petition for a child becomes the model for the required national commitment.
Absolutely. She doesn't just pray for a son, she makes a vow. She vows that if she's given a son, she will dedicate him back to God as a Nazirite. And this is the core instruction for national recovery.
Let's just elaborate on what that Nazirite commitment truly entailed, because it wasn't a small thing, it was extreme.
It was incredibly extreme. The Nazirite vow signified a life of total separation and consecrated service. For most people, it was a temporary vow, but Samuel was dedicated to it for his entire life.
And the commitment involved what? Not cutting your hair?
Not cutting the hair, avoiding all grape products, wine, raisins, everything, and maintaining a constant state of ritual purity. Our source describes this as a life of radical devotion, almost like perpetual mourning and absolute separation from the typical concerns of society. Your whole life is dedicated entirely to God's service.
So Hannah's successful prayer, which results in the birth of the ideal leader, Samuel, it doesn't just offer hope, it models the required path for the shattered nation. The message is, if God is to restore us, if our prayers are answered and the land is recovered, we must in turn dedicate ourselves completely to living according to God's will, embracing this level of Nazirite commitment.
This is the prerequisite for restoration. It is the national vow. And this profound collective commitment, it leads to the ultimate purpose, which is something far beyond mere political stability. The goal is becoming a priestly nation.
If they achieve this Nazirite commitment, they fulfill their destiny as a priestly nation. What does that specifically mean in this exilic context?
Well, it's really necessary to define the function of the priesthood, the iogram. That word implies a bridge or a ladder. A priest is an intermediary.
A connection between two things.
A connection. Israel's purpose was never simply to live securely in Canaan, enjoying wealth and blessings while being isolated from the world. Their destiny was to be a bridge nation, a channel or a ladder that could guide all the surrounding nations back to God. They were meant to be the way the world encountered the divine.
That reframes the entire mission. The exiles weren't just supposed to yearn for a powerful kingdom like Egypt or Babylon. They were supposed to commit to becoming a devoted nation that served the world by connecting it to God.
Yes. The lesson they were meant to learn in Babylon was not just to mourn their failed monarchy, but to realize they had failed their primary mission. They had ceased to be that dedicated, world-serving bridge nation. If they were given a land, they were required to be the ladder between heaven and earth.
And this deep theological requirement, this call for absolute commitment hidden in Hannah's story, this is the true starting point of the book of Samuel.
It is. And if they missed that lesson, if they failed to grasp the significance of Samuel's Nazirite life and Hannah's vow, they were doomed to repeat the cycle of collapse, regardless of who was sitting on the throne.
It is really remarkable how much profound foundational theology these exilic authors packed into just the titles and the opening scenes of these texts. But this leads us directly to the source's powerful critique, which is the persistent failure, across generations, to grasp the core message.
This failure is systemic. Our source argues that interpretations so often focus only on the peripheral issues. The term they use is, it's like you're just hitting the perimeter, the edge of the drum.
And you miss the center.
And you routinely miss the deep, intended theme, the core.
Can you give us a concrete example of how this plays out, both in the ancient text and in modern religious understanding? Because this is where the relevance really lands for you, the listener.
Sure. Look at the story of Samson in Judges, which comes right before Samuel. If you reduce that complex narrative to a simple morality tale, don't fall for bad women or don't cut your hair, you have completely and utterly missed the exilic author's point.
Right.
The core theme was the tragic failure of a divinely appointed deliverer whose lack of spiritual integrity and consecrated commitment betrayed his entire nation. It's a massive indictment of leadership failure, not just a personal cautionary tale.
Or Hannah's prayer, which we just discussed.
Yeah.
If a modern congregation reads that, so often it's reduced to a formula for achieving personal blessings.
Right, how to get your prayers answered.
Or how to have children.
Yeah.
And in doing that, they completely ignore the massive national Nazarite vow it represents, which demands this radical societal dedication.
We are constantly mistaking the sojai, the material, or the anecdote, for the jujai, the theme or the governing principle. And the modern focus on personal piety or individual prosperity, while ignoring the systemic crisis that brought the nation to ruin in the first place, is exactly the failure the exilic authors were trying to prevent.
This sounds so much like a critique we hear repeatedly in the text itself. The source specifically references Jesus's devastating analogy, the one directed at the religious scholars and teachers of his day, the scribes and Pharisees.
Yes, the famous analogy of straining out the gnat and swallowing the camel. The scribes were obsessed with precise legal calculations. They would rigorously calculate the tithing of even the smallest garden herbs mint dill, kemen. The source refers to it as the rigorous calculation of widoya oisi. They were hyper-focused on the fractional math and the legal minutiae of the law.
But in that obsessive focus on the fractional math, they completely, utterly neglected the essential spirit and the weightier matters of the law.
They abandoned what truly mattered: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. The source uses the words "durenner jadu." They adhered strictly to the legal mechanism of the tithes, but they abandoned the moral foundation it was meant to represent. The gnat was the trivial detail. The camel was the existential requirement of moral duty.
So they were so busy arguing over how to count the parsley that they ignored the collapse of their community's ethics.
That's a perfect way to put it. And how does our source apply this critique, swallowing the camel, to modern religious and scholarly leadership? The critique is direct and it is urgent.
I can imagine.
The source argues that many contemporary leaders are focused obsessively on individual trivial concerns, personal peace, individualized prosperity, achieving small, measurable blessings. They are talking about the weather, your personal circumstances, instead of discerning the historical storm that is brewing around our entire species.
They're failing to address the major systemic issues, the signs of the times, or...
Yes, the things that should be the primary subject of theological concern. The parallel is stunningly clear. In the Judges period, the people were doing what was right in their own eyes because they lacked a true moral anchor. In the time of Jesus, the religious leaders were obsessing over trivial law while ignoring justice.
And today, the source suggests, we are focusing on individual comfort while ignoring the one systemic crisis that threatens our collective future.
They're acting like experts who can look at the sky and predict tomorrow's local forecast, but cannot discern the epoch-defining existential threat that hangs over all of humanity. They have mistaken the peripheral material for the core theme of survival and duty.
This failure to grasp the core, this inability to see the camel for the gnats, it brings us to the most urgent and, I have to say, the most frightening part of this deep dive. Our source argues that the true subject of theology, of art, and of all scholarly concern must be confronting the most difficult and existential problems facing the era, not just discussing abstract religious topics or individual comfort. And the failure to do this today is a direct repetition of the historical errors detailed in Judges and critiqued by Jesus.
The source is explicit. It doesn't pull any punches. The greatest contemporary crisis, the one that should be the primary concern of all intellectual and spiritual institutions, is climate change. The source uses the term gruyere to emphasize the immediate, life-threatening nature of this global shift.
And the source elevates this. It's not just a policy debate. It's framed as an existential certainty. Humanity faces a great extinction, Afalo. They compare our current trajectory to the fate of the dinosaurs, where an entire species just vanished, leaving only residual evidence, like footprints, of their existence.
And the evidence cited is specific, it's immediate, and it's intentionally alarming to try and shake us out of our complacency. We are told that the summer we just experienced was likely the coolest summer we will ever experience again. The heating process is accelerating, it's not stabilizing.
And this isn't just some abstract global measurement. It's already impacting local ecology in dramatic ways. The source highlights marine life, specifically pollock and squid disappearing from traditionally fertile waters in the East Sea.
They're migrating.
They're migrating further north because the waters are simply too warm for them to survive.
This is a collapse of the ecosystem upon which human civilization depends. And the source stresses the terrifying reality of the irreversible nature of this process. The melting of vast glaciers requires thousands of years to recover. If the melting continues unchecked, that process becomes permanent, leading to catastrophic, irreversible consequences for global human habitability.
This is why the analogy of the Great Extinction is used. It is the potential end of our shared human story.
It is.
So if the historical books were written during the Babylonian captivity to guide the exiles out of their national destruction, then this modern crisis, the potential end of humanity on this planet, should undeniably be the primary subject of theology. It should be the core of sermons and the singular focus of the church, the Hoin, and all spiritual leadership.
And yet, the historical failure repeats itself. The critique continues. Many religious perspectives dismiss this threat entirely. They often resort to a kind of theological apathy. The reasoning is frequently something like, well, Jesus is coming soon, so don't worry about this world. This physical realm is destined for destruction anyway.
That fatalistic viewpoint represents the ultimate failure to grasp the original Nazirite commitment. By rejecting the world, they are rejecting the concept of the priestly nation, the nation meant to be the bridge for the world.
They are actively undermining the very purpose that was established in Hannah's vow.
Wow.
The source brings in some powerful sociological context here regarding the definition of religion, or O. That word often contains the character for final or ultimate. Sociologists and anthropologists argue that religion is meant to be the ultimate guide, the last hope, the highest moral authority in society. If religion fails to address existential issues, if it is swallowed by the gnat, then there is nowhere left for society to turn for guidance on matters of survival.
This is the historical lament tied directly to our present. 2,500 years after the exiles desperately yearned for a Samuel to lead them out of their self-inflicted destruction, the situation is globally, exponentially worse.
We have failed to learn the lessons of history, the necessity of the true spiritual leader, the need for the Nazirite commitment, and we are now heading toward a global extinction. The severity of the current crisis, the source argues, is a direct result of the continuous failure of religious and scholarly leadership to fulfill their essential role as discerning guides.
To focus on justice, mercy, and faithfulness, rather than on trivial concerns.
It's the definition of the chaos described at the end of Judges, but played out on a global stage. Everyone doing what is right in their own eyes because we lack a true, recognized spiritual king or guide in the spirit of Samuel. When scholars and preachers are busy straining out the gnats, discussing personal prosperity and trivial doctrines, they are collectively allowing the camel, a crisis that threatens to wipe out creation, to pass by completely unchecked.
The source even mentions figures like Stephen Hawking, who essentially told humanity to look for life off-planet.
Right. Implicitly declaring that the situation on Earth was rapidly becoming hopeless. If we are supposed to be the priestly nation, the bridge for the world, yet our leaders preach apathy and indifference toward the planet, we have not only repeated the errors of Israel's fall, but we have magnified them to a global, possibly final scale. If history teaches us anything, it's that ignoring the crisis means destruction. And this time, there is nowhere left to flee.
So to synthesize this powerful, and I have to say, revisionist deep dive, the books of Joshua, Judges, and Samuel are so much more than historical accounts. They were a revolutionary blueprint for national restoration, written by exiles who were facing their own destruction. And the shocking conclusion, the one we really have to internalize, is that the book titled Samuel wasn't a narrative about the kings it named Saul and David. It was an urgent declaration about the need for a specific, consecrated leader, Samuel, and a required national commitment, modeled by Hannah's Nazirite vow, that was necessary to solve a devastating societal and existential crisis.
And that historical lesson is terrifyingly relevant. The systemic existential threat we face today, the Great Extinction threat, is our modern equivalent of the Babylonian captivity. We are adrift, doing what is right in our own eyes, because our focus has been perpetually misplaced on political success and personal comfort. We've completely ignored the core requirement of justice, mercy, and responsibility to the world.
We have to ask ourselves, you have to ask yourself, are we fulfilling our purpose as the priestly nation, the bridge for the world? Or are we just another society focused on the fractional math of the gnat while swallowing the camel of our own global destruction?
We've established that the title Samuel carries the weight of the entire narrative. It acts as the thematic guide and the ideal against which Saul and David were measured and found wanting. But the question that remains, and it's the one the original authors forced upon their readers, is this. If Samuel's name was used to lead this entire historical narrative, even through the time of the great King David, who exactly was Samuel, And why was he considered the historical equivalent of Moses?
That is the ultimate character we must analyze to truly understand the nature of the consecrated leader the world so desperately needs today. A profound question to ponder as you look at the signs of our own times.
Indeed.